Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're all having a good Monday out there today. Another start of the work week for those of you that do have to work during this pandemic that we have going on. We all appreciate the efforts and services and safety that you're all providing for us during this time. Anyway, today is just going to be a fairly short video. It's a mail day video, so I just have a couple of items to review today. I received these last week, and of course I had some other boxes and other things that I was opening and other videos that I was doing. So anyway, I actually bought a lot of like 8 or 9 or 10 of these. I can't remember how many came into it, but it's a set of 10 cards from 1991. I'm going to open this off camera. But there used to be a track in Texas. I understand it's going to be demolished here fairly soon, known as Texas World Speedway. Many people confuse this with the current track, Texas Motor Speedway. Texas Motor Speedway is in the Dallas-Fort Worth greater metropolitan area, I believe in Denton, Texas. Texas World Speedway was in College Station, Texas. It was open in the late 60s, early 70s. It was basically a clone track to Michigan International Speedway, owned by the same people. And the last NASCAR race was held there in 1981. The track kind of fell into a state of disrepair. A group purchased the track, and they staged a set of ARCA races in 91, 92, and the final in 93. The track has since went into disrepair. From what I understand, Copart, the automotive group, is leasing the land to store their excess vehicles that were damaged by hurricanes and floods and so forth. And the land has now been bought by a residential company, so it will be demolished and turned into residential, either apartments or neighborhoods or whatever. But this is a set of 10 cards from 1991, talking about the grand opening of that particular track, or the reopening of the track. And what they are is they're just highlight cards that go back over the years and highlight the different drivers and moments of the previous years at Texas World Speedway. There you see Benny Parsons. He won the last NASCAR Cup Series race there. Was the 81 Budweiser 400. There you see the top 5 of that race. We'll kind of go through these. 1972 Buddy Baker, that's during a pit stop. Yes, the crews would put hoses in the car and the drivers would cool themselves off. There was no methods to cool the drivers on board at that time. There you see the top 5 in the 72 Texas 500. 1969 Bobby Isaac. Looks like a Dodge Daytona, or it could be a Plymouth Superbird. I really can't tell the cars apart, but is one of those Mopar brands. The 1969 Texas 500. And I like how it gives you the top 5. Okay, it was a Dodge Daytona, so that answers that question. 1980, Cale Yarborough. He was driving for Junior Johnson at this time in the Busch Beer Chevrolet. It was an Oldsmobile. They ran Oldsmobiles and Chevys. They just kind of flipped and flopped back and forth depending on what ran better at what track. You have Richard Petty, 1972. Nice picture of Richard there. The Lone Star 500. Cuckoo Marlin with a nice top 5 finish. Cuckoo, of course, the father of former NASCAR driver Sterling Marlin. Here's a nice picture of Tim Richmond, 1981. Driving for D.K. Ulrich. There you see, Benny was the winner. We did have that on the first card, or actually it was card number 2. And we have Richard Petty and Bill France. That's a Bill France Sr., the founder of NASCAR, or one of the founders. 1973 Alamo 500, top 5 right there. We have Cale Yarborough, 1980. There's that Busch Beer Chevrolet again. Kevin Harvick ran a throwback paint scheme a year or 2 ago at Darlington that looked very similar to that, with the Busch Beer livery. And the final card of the set, Darrell Waltrip, 1979, driving for Dygaard. There you see that, top 5. Terry Labonte with a nice 5th place run during his rookie season in 1979. So that is one of the sets that I got in the got in the mail the other day. Really enjoyed that set. I do have a few more there. So, and the other set I purchased, And I've been wanting to get this for a while. It's Hot Stuff. It's a company called Hot Stuff Racing Cards, and they're the ARCA Permatex series back in 1991. So we'll go through these rather quickly, because there's not going to be many names that a lot of you guys will be familiar with. So you have Bob Brevac. He was the champion the previous year. So and they're not even in numerical order. I got to go through and do these. There you have Gary Weinbrough, and I'm not even going to flip them over because that's too much right now. Keith Wade. And you're going to see some really, really weird paint jobs and some really different sponsors that you'll probably never heard of. And you look at the numbers on that car, you can tell that those were probably done locally to that driver. So this ARCA, still to this day, is still a series that's almost a developmental series, but also a series that people can go in and race at a lower price. Here you have a checklist. We have David Boggs. David had ran some Cup Series and Busch Series races back in the 70s and early 80s. Eric Smith. I don't know much about Eric, but it does look like it's an old Ford, and it could be an old Ford that used to that Mark Martin may have ran at one time in the Busch Series in 1987. Now this is Cecil Eunice. This team was owned by a gentleman named Carroll Levin. They moved up to the Busch Series eventually and had some decent runs. Charlie Glotzback. That is a former Chevrolet that Dale Earnhardt had raced at one time that was purchased from Richard Childress. And of course Charlie has a few wins in the Cup Series. Mark Gibson. He was a long-time driver in the ARCA Series. Ken Rowley, don't really know anything about that guy, but obviously raced in ARCA in the early 90s. Tom Bigelow, former USAC standout, he made a few starts in the Indy 500, I believe, in the mid-80s. Richard Hines, don't know anything about him, and I apologize that I don't know anything about these guys. They may have only made one or two starts in the series, and ARCA needed to the company wanted to make a nice set, which they did. Huggins Tire Sales, obviously a provider of the Goodyear line. This is Bob Keselowski. He is the father of current NASCAR star Brad Keselowski, and also the father of Brad's brother, Brian Keselowski. Scott Hansen ran many years in the ASA Series. He also ran a couple years in the Truck Series. I know he did run 1 year for Ken Schrader. He's a really good short track driver over the years. Brian Jager. Not real familiar with Brian. Ben Hess. Ben was a pretty good ARCA driver. He did start the 1989 Cup Series running for Rookie of the Year, but the team ran out of money about 8 races in. But he did have several good runs in the ARCA Series and won a few times on the big super speedways. Scott Stovall, the Zero Hero from Fort Wayne, Indiana. Scott was a longtime competitor in the ARCA and the USAC Stock Car Series over the years. Jerry Hufflin. Dave Simcoe. Dave was a longtime ARCA competitor. His sister Patty Simcoe was a driver as well. Patty married former ARCA driver Bob Schacht, but Patty had a scary crash in 1986 at Pocono. I'm sure that video is on YouTube. Dave also had several Cup Series starts over the years, mostly running at places like Michigan, and I think occasionally he might run Atlanta. There's a few tracks in there that he would run that the ARCA Series would run on, so he had familiarity. Mark Thompson. Mark Thompson is the owner of Phoenix Air. Just made his last Cup Series start a couple of years ago. He's retired from racing, and he's former pilot in the Air Force. Mike Fry. Not sure. Don't really have any information on him. Carl Muscatin III, he ran a few years in the ARCA Series, was involved in a horrible crash in 1991 at Talladega that took the life of Chris Gerke. There's Bobby Massey. I believe he was a short track competitor for many years. Frank Kimmel, this guy would eventually become probably one of the greatest ARCA drivers of all time, and practically unbeatable in the late 80s or late 90s, early 2000s in the ARCA Series. I believe he has 10 series championships, if I remember. Ken Reagan, father of recently semi-retired driver David Reagan. Ken ran his own equipment most of his career. I'm not sure who he got this car from, but it's got a kind of a wild paint job going on there. Gary Hawes. I apologize, I don't have any information on him. And a lot of these cars may be former Busch Series or Winston Cup Series cars that the teams wanted to get rid of. So that's why some of the paint schemes may look familiar, but they don't have the right sponsors to match because the teams just took the teams bought from the Cup teams. They didn't repaint them. They just labeled them with their own sponsors. Joe Boer. Joe was from Indiana, Montmorency, Indiana. He passed away in 1993. He was tragically killed in the Goodies Dash Series race that year. Joe would frequently run just about anywhere when he'd get the time or the money to show up, if it was ARCA or Cup or whatever. It might be Daytona, it might be Dover, it might be Michigan, but Joe would just show up. Action at Daytona. I know that's Ken Reagan in the 47. Let me look off screen. It says Keith Wade in the 20. Mark Gibson, longtime ARCA competitor. Atlanta Action 91. I'm pretty sure it's Lee Raymond and Bob Brevac. Roy Payne. And this was when Dodge was just starting to get their footing back into the stock car racing series. Roy became a competitor in the Busch Series for a few years. Craig Rubright, he ran in the ARCA Series in the early 90s, had a few decent runs. We got more Daytona action. Looks like Charlie Glotzback and Bob Keselowski, and who's the third guy? We just had that card. Says Donnie Moran. Donnie Moran was in the 99 car that day. David Elliott, I apologize, don't have any information on David. Graham Taylor, I know Graham ran some ARCA races in the early 90s. Roger Blackstock. Roger was a mainstay in the ARCA series from the mid-80s to the mid-90s. And he had a pretty wicked crash in the 1985 running of the Fall Atlanta ARCA race. Even though it was ran in 1985, it was part of the 1986 season. That video is on YouTube as well. Atlanta, in the old configuration, had a stack of tires at the end of pit road. His car spun, hit those tires, and did a lazy barrel roll. And I'm sure it made some of the sports highlights back in 1985. But he raced, Roger raced ARCA for many, many years. Here we have Hoosier Tire, based out of Newton, Bob Newton's company. I think they were based out of Lakeville, Indiana. But or Lakeland, Indiana. They were based north of here. I can't remember exactly, but Bob Newton was the owner of the company for a long time. Glenn Sullivan. Don't know much about Glenn, but that team, the Target Expediting team, was a solid team on the speedways. Ben Hess ran really good for them when he drove for them. Farrell Harris. Farrell ran in the Cup Series on and off in the late 70s, early 80s, and you can tell by that paint job, those of you that know NASCAR history, that is a car from 1989 of Derek Copes based on that paint job. That would have been a Purelator Pontiac owned by Bob Whitcomb. Brad Holman. Don't have any information on Brad. And it does, the backs of the cards do have personal information about the drivers. I've just never went through and read these. Like I said, just opened these up last night. I wanted to get an idea of what I had in here. Bobby Boucher. He's the son of Jack Boucher, who was a former ARCA Series champion, as well as Bobby. Bobby's son Todd also ran in the ARCA Series for a number of years. Bill Venturini years ago had an all-female pit crew. Bill was a former ARCA Series champion, and Bill currently has several teams. Him and his son Billy have some of the top cars in the ARCA Series right now. Dale McDowell, former ARCA Rookie of the Year, I believe. Bill Flowers. Bill made a couple attempts at Winston Cup races back in the mid-80s. Bob Brevac, longtime series veteran. I believe he was the previous year. I think he was the 1990 champion, if I remember right. Mike Wallace. And this is the brother of Rusty and Kenny. So Mike was getting his stock car start in the early 90s in the ARCA series. Jerry Cook. I think this is the Jerry Cook that no, that's a different Jerry Cook that ran modifieds. So I was just looking at the back of the card. This is not the same NASCAR Jerry Cook. Glenn Brewer. Glenn is the brother of former NASCAR crew chief Tim Brewer. Mike Davis. Don't have any information about Mike. Bobby Gerhart, who continues to run in the ARCA series. He did miss the Daytona race this year because he had a heart attack during the off season, but I'm sure Bobby will be back next year. Bobby's won 8 races at Daytona in the ARCA series, so he's got a pretty good car for that race. Lee Raymond. Lee Raymond passed away a few years ago, but Lee was a standout on the ARCA Super Speedways. Bob Dodder Sr., father of current Xfinity team owner Bobby Dodder. Bob ran many, many years in the ARCA series and in the ASA series. Bob, you really can't see it real good on this car, but Bob lost his left hand, so he always had not really a prosthesis, but almost like a hook or something that he would drive with on his left side. But Bob was retired several years ago, and I believe he just passed away about 4 or 5 years ago. Jimmy Horton. Jimmy is known for his 1993 crash at Talladega. Y'all need to go on YouTube and look that one up. But in 1993, Jimmy had a spectacular crash. During this time, 1990, Jimmy had a spectacular year in ARCA. He won several races on the big tracks driving for car owner Stan Hover. Ron Otto. Apologize, I don't have information on Ron. And because some of these guys may have just ran 1 or 2 races during the season, so Hot Stuff wanted to have a nice set, which they did. I mentioned Chris Gerke earlier. Sadly, in 1991 at Talladega, Chris was tragically killed in a horrible accident at Talladega. Chris was an up-and-coming driver. I think he would have made it to the Busch Series. I'm not saying he wouldn't have made it to the Cup Series and he wouldn't have been a star, but at this time in his career, Chris was still learning, and tragically he had the accident that took his life at Talladega in 91. Jerry Hill. Jerry is the father of current NASCAR driver and recent iRacing winner Timmy Hill. So Jerry ran many, many races in the ARCA series. Ran a handful in the Cup Series over the years in the early 90s. Larry Couch. Says it looks like that picture obviously was at Atlanta Raceway, but I really don't remember much of Larry's career. Dorsey Schrader. Dorsey was a very, very successful racer in the IMSA series, the road racing series. He dabbled in ARCA and in the Cup Series a handful of times. Didn't really have the success pan out, went back to road racing, and now occasionally he helps to be a color commentator on some of the races for the different networks for the road racing, if it's the 24 Hours of Daytona, 12 Hours of Sebring, so on and so forth. Billy Thomas. Billy was a longtime competitor in ARCA. He did have a flip in the 1987 Spring Talladega race. Another picture of Bobby Boucher. We had Bobby a little while ago. Bill Venturini. A nice look at Bill's car. And our last couple ones, Chet Blanton and the ARCA show car. So as you can see, this is a pretty interesting set, because you got a handful of drivers that did a little bit. You have a handful of drivers that may have only ran a race or 2 in ARCA. But I do appreciate that set. I'm always looking to pick up unique sets like this to add to my collection. They make nice little reference points. And also just unique photography opportunities. You can look at the cars, and if somebody online is like, oh, I don't remember this car, can somebody have a picture? Boom, you have a picture of it. So I just enjoy these oddball little sets, picking them up. They'll get put in the some of the jewel cases that I have, and I'll get them put away in one of my boxes. But once again, we're still right around 70 subs. I think we did hit 70 subs yesterday, so I appreciate that. Once we get to 100, we'll have a giveaway, and you all know the rules on that one. It's either going to be a Tony Stewart, a Ken Griffey Jr., or a Braun Strowman, depending on whoever wins and whatever they want, so I appreciate that. And once again, I want to send a shout out to excuse me, to Danny and Gray on his channel. Keep a lookout on their channel. They're doing a good job over there. So I think Danny said he's got a break coming up soon, so we'll get involved in that break. And then also, Ricky Wittenberg has a podcast out called Racing Through Time. It's kind of a retrospective of the 1986 Cup Series season. So make sure you check that out on whatever podcast app. I check it out on SoundCloud. I know he has it on iTunes. And like I said, he recently did an interview with me this past weekend. I have not had a chance to listen to that episode yet. I'm a couple episodes behind. But he goes through and reviews all the races and everything. So I'm excited to get involved with that a little bit. And I appreciate all you guys watching this video. I know it was a couple of sets that maybe you guys hadn't ever seen before, but I hope it was something that was a little bit interesting, a little bit different. So I thank you all you guys for watching. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you again tomorrow. Have a great day.